Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear from another one of the expert witnesses instructed by the inquiry. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, could we have Dr. Barbara Lane, please?
If I could ask you to remain standing for when time to take the oath. If you'd like to take the Bible in your hand, if you'd read from the screen, please.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lane. And good morning. Sit down and make yourself comfortable.
Yeah, thank you.
All right? Oh, yes.
Just want to
Get yourself a drink, yes?
Yes.
Good. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, good morning, Dr. Lane. Thank you very much for returning to the inquiry to assist us with our work. It's very much appreciated. I'm going to be asking you questions today about your fire safety engineering report, which was prepared for Module 1 of Phase 2 of this inquiry. Ms. Grogan will then be asking you questions at some point tomorrow about your CDM, Construction Design Management Report, and your report into compliance with Regulation 38 of the Building Regulations 2010. If you don't understand any of my questions, please ask me to repeat the question or put the point in a different way to you. And if you can keep your voice up at all times, because there's a lady transcribing to your right who's trying to take a very clear note of everything we're saying. Now, so you, on your fire engineering report, you've provided to the inquiry a report entitled The Fire Safety Engineer Main Report. That was initially dated the 30th of October 2019. The reference to that is BLARP 603, and there was an appendix to that report as well. You then prepared an updated report, version 2, dated the 15th of May 2020. The reference to that is BLARP 5010. And then you have very recently provided us with a further updated report dated the 22nd of October 2020, and the reference for that is BLARP 5017. If we could just bring that up.
Yeah, that's
there
correct.
We have, and that's your latest report.
Yes.
And that has an appendix to it, which is at BLARP 5018. If you just bring that appendix up as well, thank you. That's Appendix A. And you've also helpfully produced a corrections and addenda document which sets out exactly what those changes are as between the May and the October report.
That's correct.
For the transcript, that's BLARP 25014. And can you just confirm that in that latest version of your report, none of the conclusions in your report have changed as between the May and the October version?
No, they have not.
Thank you. Now, unless I specify otherwise, when I refer to your report, I'm going to be referring to that 3rd October 2020 version.
Okay.
And I think you have a hard copy of
Yes.
that in front of you on the desk, which is paginated.
Yes.
If at any stage you want to look at the hard copy. But we'll also bring up any relevant sections on the screen.
Okay, thank you.
Now, that report focuses on the adequacy of the advice provided by the fire safety engineer ex-over Warrington Fire during the primary refurbishment. If we can bring up that report again, BLARP 25017, and go to page 344, here we can see an expert's declaration that you have prepared, and we can see a statement of truth at page 345. There we have that there. Is that your signature there at the bottom?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Now, any matters of law within your reports will be a matter for the chairman and the panel to decide. But can you confirm to us that the factual matters set out in your report are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
And can you confirm that your report accurately sets out your true and complete professional opinion on the matters addressed within it?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. So now I'm going to ask you just a few questions about your background and experience.
Okay.
Now, we did call you in phase 1 of the inquiry, so
Yeah.
I've already covered some of this, but just for everybody's benefit, I want to pick up some key points. And you've helpfully provided an updated CV for us. If we can find that and bring that up, that's BLARP2 5015. And your CV begins at page 4 of that document. Yes, thank you. So this is the recent CV that you've provided to us, is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And is it right that you're a director of ARUP, which is an independent company of designers, planners, engineers, consultants and technical specialists addressing professional services in the built environment?
Yes, I am.
And what post do you currently hold in ARUP?
At this time, I have multiple roles at ARUP, so I sit on the UKI MEA board.
Yeah.
In that capacity, I'm responsible for ARUP University, which is our learning, knowledge and skills function. I also have a safety role in that regard for our staff and premises. I'm also an operational group leader, so I run a business, one of the businesses in ARUP, which is a group of about 250 technical specialists, one team of which is ARUP Fire. Yeah. And I'm also what's called a fellow of ARUP because of my technical experience.
Yeah, thank you. And you specialise in fire safety engineering in the built environment, and you've over 20 years' experience in the construction industry in England and internationally, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you're a chartered engineer, and having recently moved to Ireland, is it right that this is with the Institute of Engineers in Ireland?
That's correct.
And you graduated from Trinity College Dublin with a degree in civil engineering?
Yes, I did.
And as you say, you're a fellow of ARUP, and is that an honorary title awarded to exceptional individuals within the firm?
Yes, it is.
And you're also a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Royal Society of Edinburgh?
Yes, I am.
And is it right that you have extensive experience as a fire engineer in drafting fire safety strategies?
Yes, I have extensive experience.
Yeah. And do you have experience of doing that for existing buildings, refurbishments and new build projects?
Yes, I do.
And in fact, if we look at page 6 of the CV document here, I think what we see is a list of existing building fire strategies.
Yes.
That you've given here. And we can see that you have experience of drafting such strategies for high-rise buildings. Is that correct?
Yes, I just gave a few project examples.
Yeah. Thank you. And then we can see on page 7 your experience of drafting fire strategies and other fire safety compliance activities on other projects, including high-rise residential buildings, including, for example, Elizabeth House in London and Project Neptune, a campus in Scotland. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And were any of those projects involving overcladding of buildings over 18 metres?
Elizabeth House, yes, it involved overcladding, and my involvement was to do with its proximity to other buildings in that context of cladding. And on Project Neptune, it was not overcladding, it was problems with cladding.
Yeah, thank you. And can you also help as to whether you have experience acting as a fire engineer in design and build projects?
Yes, I do, and I wanted to just set out those numbers in my CV. So I have I'm registered on the ARUP system as having worked on over 480 projects in the last 23 years. 96 of them were what's classified as design and build projects. 62 of those, my client was the principal contractor.
Great, thank you, that's very helpful. Now, moving on, I want to ask you some questions about fire safety engineering and fire strategies. In the first substantive section of your report, at section 2, you've helpfully explained the definitions of certain key terms and concepts relevant to the role of a fire safety engineer. And I want to start by just looking at the definition of a fire engineer. If we go to page 13 in your report, that's BLA, thank you. Someone's there very quickly. We can see there that you have given us at 2.2.1 the Institution of Fire Engineers defines a fire engineer as follows. And then what we have is it says through education, training and experience a fire engineer understands. And then we have a list of things there that a fire engineer will understand, including the nature, characteristics and mechanisms of fire, the spread and control of fire. And then if we look to the penultimate bullet point, the likely behaviour of materials, structures, machines, apparatus and processes as related to the protection of life, property and the environment from fire. And the last bullet point, the interaction and integration of fire safety systems and all other systems in buildings. So there we have that definition. Now, in terms of the Institute of Fire Engineers, is it right that they are a registered charity who assess the knowledge of fire and professional experience, and they award internationally recognised membership grades and fire-related qualifications?
Yes, that's my understanding.
And is it also right that through its Engineering Council licence as a professional engineering institution, the IFE registered suitably qualified IFE members as chartered engineers? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Now, all those areas there, I take it that those are all areas you would expect a reasonably competent fire engineer to have an understanding of?
As a minimum.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to ask you a little bit later about competence requirements for fire engineers.
Okay.
But for now, I just wanted to get a sense of what the key areas of
Okay.
knowledge were. Then in terms of the definition of fire engineering, if we can go on page 17 of your report to para 2.6.1, there we've got the Institute of Fire Engineers definition, and it says there, fire engineering is the application of scientific and engineering principles, rules, codes and expert judgment based on an understanding of the phenomena and effects of fire and of the reaction and behaviour of people to fire to protect people, property and the environment from the destructive effects of fire. You see that there?
Yes.
And we can see also the definition of fire safety engineering at paragraph 2.7.1 on page 18 of your report.
Yeah.
And this is from the British Standard published document 79740/2002. And is it right that the published document series were a series of documents published by the British Standards Institute to provide additional guidance in support of separate British standards?
Yes, that's correct.
And there we get the definition of fire safety engineering from that published document is the application of scientific and engineering principles to the protection of people, property and the environment from fire. Now, then I want to ask you just a little bit about fire safety methodologies.
Yes.
You then go on and explain in section 2.8 of your report that there are different fire safety engineering methodologies that can be employed.
Yes.
And you highlight a distinction, if we can go on page 19 and look at, there we go, that page. So in particular at 2.8.2 and 2.8.3 on that page, you're highlighting a difference between prescriptive-based design
Yes.
and by comparison performance-based design. That's a distinction you're drawing, isn't it?
Yes.
And at 2.8.3 you say, so 282, you say prescriptive-based design relies on the prescribed performances, requirements, recommendations or detailing as exactly set out in a design code or standard. So you follow a prescriptive code.
Exactly, you rely.
Whereas by comparison, performance-based design models are deemed to be an alternative approach, and these are also assumed to be derived on a first principles basis.
Yes.
Yeah. And you then give us a helpful example at the bottom of page 19 on that same page. If we can look at that. So you illustrate the difference there, and you say the layout of a building floor with respect to the position of a fire escape stair core could be designed on the following basis. And you say on the prescriptive design side, you could apply the rules on maximum travel distances, minimum stair widths, as shown in the statutory guidance for that purpose group. That would be a prescriptive design, is that right?
Prescriptive method.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you contrast that in B with a performance-based design, which would be setting maximum exposure criteria for the desired number of occupants in terms of smoke inhalation, visibility and temperature exposure, and then quantifying how occupants in the building can be protected for those conditions in any reasonable design basis, and formulating a number and width of required staircases for the relevant evacuation methods.
Yes.
So that's your helpful definition of performance-based design.
Yes, so trying to show the difference between the two methods.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's very helpful. Now, you explain in section 2.11 of your report on page 23 that it's also possible to carry out fire engineering analysis. And you tell us that this term commonly refers to the use of advanced computational tools
Yes.
to quantify the performance of fire and smoke as part of a building design process and the resulting consequences on people and structures. And you give a number of examples
Yes.
there. So computational fluid dynamics, finite element modelling, simulation software. And you tell us that methodologies to undertake those analyses are defined in the British standard that you give there.
Yes, that's correct.
2.11.2, and you give some examples. Now, with all of that in mind, at 2.10 of your report, you then deal with the definition of a fire safety strategy.
Yeah.
You've explained a number of things about that, and I'll take you to some of the paragraphs in your report, but perhaps you can just help us at this stage. Can you just explain briefly, in your own words, what a fire safety strategy is?
A fire safety strategy is a document, depending on the stage of the works it's being produced for, has a certain quantity of information in it. I'll just focus on the final stage and just talk about a detailed fire strategy or the final fire strategy.
Yeah.
It would address in England the 5 parts of the building regulations, the fire safety objectives for the project, the fire safety goals, how those goals were to be met, and all the active and passive systems, the characteristics of the building, the characteristics of the people, and set out, it's almost, I say to myself, it's a narrative, a very detailed narrative of how the building has been created, constructed, and in the event of a fire, exactly what's provided and why.
Yeah.
So, and it should be clear enough so that the people who are impacted by fire or who are making plans in the event of a fire once the building is occupied clearly understand exactly what's there, why they need to maintain it, how they need to educate people on what to do in the event of a fire, as well as the fire brigade being able to understand and read the measures provided for them and why. Another important aspect of a fire strategy is being clear where there are risks you have not been able to mitigate, or you have mitigated them to a certain extent. And that's particularly relevant for existing buildings where you're working in, sometimes very constrained conditions. And so you have to be practical and pragmatic in terms of what protection measures are possible.
Yeah, thank you, that's very helpful. Is it right that there is no statutory definition of a fire safety strategy?
Statutory definition. So there is no statutory design guide called the fire strategy and what should be in it. No.
But is it right that we do see a definition of a fire safety strategy within published document 7974 2002? If we pull up on page 21 of your report, paragraph 2.10.1, there we see in that published document, that guidance, it states, this is with reference to paragraph 316 of that published document, it defines a fire safety strategy as a combination of fire safety measures that has been shown by reference to prescriptive codes or a fire engineering study to be capable of satisfying the specified fire safety objectives.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a shorter definition. And then if we could look at paragraph 9.7, in the next paragraph, stay there, it's 2.10.2. In the next paragraph, we can see that published document also says the fire safety strategy for the building will be based on the successful trial design and is likely to comprise a range of physical fire safety measures and management procedures.
Yeah.
A description of these measures should be provided together with the performance specifications and any recommended deviations from the relevant system code.
Yeah,
So
that's
again,
correct. Yeah.
that chimes with the more detailed description you've just given.
I hope so.
Just give us some help there. Where it talks in the first line about it be based on the successful trial design,
Yeah.
what does that mean there?
Well,
as you understand it?
Yeah, so when a project starts, there may be some basic concepts, for example, in the mind of the architect, or the client may have some objectives they're trying to meet. And depending on the circumstances, there may be more than one appropriate solution. And in the very early stages of the project, I and others would typically set out maybe 1, 2, or 3 potential solutions to a problem.
Yeah.
And then when you factor in all the other issues in design beyond fire safety, and you coordinate and think about all the other objectives of the project, one of the potential fire safety solutions may also enable other objectives on the project. So in those very early stages, it's a real to and fro, between the client or the contractor, the design team, the fire safety engineer, trying to hone in on a set of, a solution that delivers the multiple objectives for the project.
Yeah.
So that's one part of trial design. Now, trial design means other things in different countries.
Right.
And just to be absolutely clear, for example, in America, you have to set out multiple sizes of fire and analyse all different types of failures of systems and check that your preferred solution is still fit for purpose.
I see.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it can mean 2 things.
Yeah, that's helpful. And we note in the third line, it talks about it's likely to comprise a range of physical fire safety measures and management procedures. And
Yeah.
again, that's a point you made earlier, that it's also about how the building's going to be managed.
Yeah,
That's key in a fire strategy. Is that right?
Absolutely, because when the building's handed over, its life is just beginning, really, in terms of fire safety. And the people who are responsible for managing that building and protecting the people who live and work there must understand what the fire strategy is for and what it's trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So that connection to the people living and working in the building and what the fire brigade need to be able to do in various scenarios is a fundamental part of the communication needed in a fire safety strategy document.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just in that final line, it's referring there to any recommended deviations from the relevant system codes.
Yes.
Can you just give an example of what a system code might be? Could that be approved document B, for example?
It could be approved document B, it could be a British standard.
Yeah.
So, for example, at Grenfell, when Max Fordham was trying to work out how to deal with the existing physical constraints, which is a very valid part of working out what to do in an existing building. Companies like that, like ours, you work through those constraints relative to all different types of British standards when it comes to that level of detailing. And you may have to be absolutely clear with the statutory authorities. There are certain things cannot happen
Yeah.
in that building because of its physical nature.
Yeah.
And that's what that means. So you're very explicit about what can't happen, and so why it's a deviation, and what you as a professional company are recommending or offering as an alternative mitigation if a mitigation is needed.
Yeah, I understand. Can you help us? Was there any, I've asked you about a statutory definition of a fire safety strategy. Was there any statutory requirement to have a fire safety strategy for a building like Grenfell Tower? Was there any requirement that you had to have an existing fire strategy, for example?
Do you mean before the refurbishment work?
Yes.
So I think so there isn't, there isn't the approved document for a fire strategy for an existing building.
Yeah.
But I think that I see that as a bit of an excuse, if I may say, and I want to call it an excuse because hopefully in what you've just heard in the last few minutes, it's essential to have a written narrative about any building. So the people responsible for that building know what they need to do. The fire risk assessor needs to understand that narrative too when they are going to do their work. The building manager needs to understand what to do. People have to make emergency plans. There's all sorts of activities that can only be accurate and relevant if there is an understanding of all the different things in that building, the active systems, the passive systems, what's working, what's not working.
Yeah.
So whilst I accept, the phrase, there is no statutory requirement, I personally or professionally don't understand how one can discharge all the fire safety duties one has in an existing building without a written record of that building. And so, in my opinion, I think you are obliged to have a fire safety strategy for an existing building.
Yeah. And would the same logic apply to a refurbishment project as well, in that is your evidence that there might not be a statutory requirement to have a fire safety strategy, but that it is certainly necessary to have a fire safety strategy for any major refurbishment works?
Yes, because you have to understand what you're dealing with. Okay, you need to understand the baseline in the existing building before the works begin, and you see that in the evidence. Anyway, I won't talk specifically about Grenfell yet, but you have to understand the baseline. So when you're changing something or removing something, you need to understand the consequences of that in terms of the overall safety standard in the building.
Yeah.
And at Grenfell, the professional design team themselves observed that to be the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, is it also right that, in your view, one important purpose of a fire safety strategy is to identify the fire safety performance requirements on which the parties responsible for design can draw on and rely?
Sorry, could you just repeat that again, please?
So is it right that, in your view, one important purpose of a fire strategy is to identify the fire safety performance requirements on which those responsible for the design can rely?
Oh, sorry. Yes, it is my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you go as far as to say in your report, this is on page 48, paragraph 3.6.8, you say these are the founding source of the required performance criteria for the architect's fire drawing information and for other parties responsible for the design of the fire safety systems.
Yes,
Do you see that there?
Yeah, and that's linked to this issue that there may be more than one way to solve a problem.
Yeah.
Okay. So the fire safety engineer, when the toing and froing at the early stages of the project, in that circle of coordination, they have to then be clear about the fire safety objectives. So then the design team understands very clearly exactly which solution is proposed and why, and then they can carry out all their very detailed work over in the future.
Yeah. Now, if we go to paragraph 3.6.2 of your report on page 47, in terms of now you're dealing with the content of a fire strategy report.
Yeah.
And you say there is currently no formal statutory guidance on what exactly a fire strategy report should contain.
Yeah.
And then you've gone on in your report to discuss a number of pieces of guidance, including a May 2015 document produced by the Fire Industry Association called Scope of Works for the Fire Engineer,
Yes.
or the FIA Guide. If we can just bring that guide up, it's at INQ 11219. So there is that Fire Industry Association guide. We can see at the bottom of page 2 that it's dated May 2015. So I think it's right that at the time of Exova's engagement initially on the Grenfell project, this wasn't in existence. But can you help us? Why do you nevertheless review Exova's work against this Fire Industry Association guidance note?
Because all this guidance does is reflect common practice for very many years in the fire safety profession.
Yeah. So just to be clear, you consider that what's in this guidance is reflective of common industry practice prior to May 2015?
Well, industry practice is a different matter because practice can vary, can't it? It reflects a common appropriate way to conduct oneself during the REBA stages.
So good industry practice?
Sorry, yes, exactly.
Yeah. And were there any other equivalent guides or guidance notes predating 2015 which helped about what fire safety strategies should contain?
I put in that pass from,
Yes,
I can't remember the year, sorry.
I'm coming to that in a moment. Yeah.
Were there others? I mean, the 7974 series gives some help on, but other than that, I'm not particularly aware of any other detailed document.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, sorry, the CIBSE Guide on fire safety engineering is another one.
Yeah. And is it your view that this guide provides an accurate statement of what can properly be expected of a competent fire engineer fulfilling obligations in 2012 to 2016?
Oh, yes, I do.
And is it your evidence that this guide helps explain in more detail how an ordinarily competent fire engineer would be expected to fill obligations which it was undertaking in that time period?
Yes, and that's why it was published, to make that clear to the whole profession.
And just to be clear, this guide is not simply your own preferred approach?
Oh, absolutely not, no. I don't want that absolutely not to be taken as a negative. No. It's not a preferred approach.
Yeah.
It simply reflects certainly what we have done for a very long time. Yeah. And it's a useful reference for other people, other parties to understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, as you say, you've also referred to PAS 911 2007. So this PAS stands for Publicly Available Specification, PAS. And this one was titled Fire Strategies, Guidance and Frameworks for Their Formulation. And that was prepared by the British Standards Institution. If we can just go to that, this is BSI 6066. So BSI 6066. Wow, that's a mouthful. There we go. So that's another piece of guidance that you've referred to.
Yeah.
And can we just have a look at the forward to this report? It's at page 4. So this is from 2007. So we can see it says there in the orange text that it was prepared by the British Standards Institution in association with Kingfell, a multidisciplinary company. Yeah. And then it says in the second sentence, it's intended to provide guidance for the preparation and or review of a fire strategy. And then it says it does not provide detailed recommendations or specifications with respect to the application or specification of fire safety and fire protection, as this information is normally covered in national codes and standards. Instead, it provides the user with one methodology to take the national guidance and utilise it within a framework The purpose being to ensure that the fire strategy follows a consistent style and covers the main issues. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Now, before I ask you more about the contents of this document, I just want to ask you about what you said in your first version of your report in October 19 about this. If we go back to that, this is a BLARP 2 603 at page 34. And I just want to look at paragraph 3.6.7.
Yeah.
There you say that document's never been amended, nor has it been formally adopted as a British standard.
Yeah.
I'm not aware that it is in wide use in the UK construction industry, and I've never relied on it in my own professional work.
Yeah.
Therefore, I will not refer to it here. And then in the second version of your report, if we go BLARP 2 5010 at page 30, and if we look at paragraphs 2.22.6 and following, right at the bottom of that page, there we can see you tell us it's never been amended or formally adopted.
Yeah.
And then in the next paragraph, I'm not aware of having been widely referred to by the fire safety profession.
Yeah.
And then you say, however, the guidance in PAS 911 relating to the development of fire strategies, and in particular fire strategies for existing buildings, aligns with my own understanding and professional experience.
That's correct. Yeah.
And we've got the same paragraphs in your latest report, just for the transcript, that's at page 30 of your latest report. Now, reading those two together, do we understand from that although you yourself have never relied on PAS 911 in your own professional work, it does in fact align with your own professional understanding and experience?
Yeah, so it's not a document I take out and read all the time, and it's not a document I refer to when I'm writing my own fire safety strategies.
Yeah.
I'm obliged to listen to evidence, as you know, and after I listened to the Exova evidence, there was a lot of confusion around definitions, and I thought it might be better if my own opinion wasn't simply on its own, that the panel had the opportunity to read a published guidance document and not just rely on my experience.
Yeah.
And I felt I had to do that when I reissued my report.
Yeah. And that's why we see some more references to the PAS 911 standard in your later versions of your report.
Not very many, I would like to say.
No.
Just one or two additional references.
Yeah. And at 2.22.8 at the bottom of that page, we can see that what you're highlighting particularly is that it gives some useful guidance for existing building fire strategies.
Yeah,
Is that
exactly.
correct?
I mean, I think like all engineers, I probably suffer from a difficulty in explaining what I do to other people. I think it's a bit of a common feature. So sometimes it's better to allow people to contemplate it being written in a clearer way.
Yeah.
And I think the language in that document around existing fire strategies, I felt it might help.
Yeah. Now let's just look at some of the extracts you've given us. If we go to page 24 of your report, we can see you've given us an extract here, if we can blow that up. So this is an extract from section 7.1.3 of that document, and it's specifically about, we can see from the little title then below that, fire strategies for existing buildings. And is it right that what this does is set out a step-by-step approach to the preparation of a fire strategy for an existing building?
Yeah.
And we can see that, for example, A, we have a planning meeting. B, research. So there's a research step. Is that right?
Yes.
Where all data, records, documents and relevant codes are subjected to detailed review.
Yeah.
And then if we jump 2 down to D, we can see it has site activities. Is that right?
Yes.
So for existing buildings, this will incorporate audits and surveys of the building, occupants, services, systems. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to come back, just to be clear, and ask you about the site visit that was done to Grenfell Tower in the context of writing the existing fire safety strategy.
Yeah.
But at this stage, I just wanted to note that we can see here site activities is one of the steps.
May I say something at this point?
Yes.
So as a for a fire engineering company, doing an existing fire strategy is a much higher risk professional activity than a new build fire strategy. And I think I just would like to explain that now before we go on. Because, you have less control and knowledge of what you're dealing with. If you have a blank piece of paper and you're working with everyone at the time, that's, let's call it, that's one level of commercial risk. But for an existing building strategy, the commercial risk is you miss something, you don't know something, you're not told something.
Yeah.
So it's a very different type of professional activity. And I would like to be able to refer back to that point again later on.
Yes,
please.
of course. Oh, of course.
Yeah.
And then what we can see from this outline in PAS 911 is that there are then several layers of review. We can see at E, a first review. Then we get an outline draft strategy at F, a second review, a final draft strategy. So that is envisaging a number of iterations of the report. Is that correct?
Yes, if it's needed as a function of when you're receiving information and the level of information you receive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then even after that final draft strategy, we've got the third review.
Yes.
Involving meetings with stakeholders.
Yes.
Any final issues need to be corrected, and then J, issue the strategy.
Exactly.
So that's a helpful guide from this published document about what's envisaged for existing fire strategies.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then if we can look at page 25, the next page of your report, we can see there that you've extracted for us a process chart for existing buildings. And really what that does, I think, is just put into diagrammatical form what we saw in the earlier table. Is that right?
Yeah.
Or the earlier text. So we can see those steps there. And then if we look at page 22 of your report, you've also exhibited another figure from the PAS 911 document. If we can blow that up, this is called the design basis. Is it right that I think what this does is it shows 7 forms of input into a fire strategy? Those are the boxes at the top.
Yes.
And then they feed down into the fire strategy.
Yes.
And then you've got various components of that fire strategy. And then it's broken down again in terms of the specification, arrangement and design of certain things.
Yes.
And also policies and procedures.
Yes.
And we can see that there needs to be reference to policies and procedures for managing fire safety, responsibilities and authorities, etc. So this is, as I understand it, this is just what all the different inputs are into a fire strategy. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's almost like different layers of consideration.
Yeah.
And I put this in because, again, there was confusion regarding the statutory fire risk assessment as opposed to assessing risk in one's work as a fire safety engineer. And I thought that this design basis explained the role of risk assessment in fire safety engineering work.
Yeah.
And it's such a major component of our work when we're honing in on a solution.
Yes, yes. Now, that very topic I want to come to now, which is the interaction between a fire safety strategy and a fire risk assessment.
Okay.
Now, one of the matters you discuss in some detail in your report is that interrelationship between those two things.
Yes.
Now, just by way of background, is it right that the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, and this is at paragraph 9.1, requires a suitable and sufficient assessment of risks to which relevant persons are exposed to be carried out by the responsible person? Now, that's a short form of that duty.
That's correct.
Yeah. And that fire risk assessment is expected to include the identification of fire hazards, is that right?
Yes.
And the evaluation of the risk and the fire precautions designed to reduce risk.
Yes.
And what your report does, and I'm not going to have time to take you to all of the passages in your report, but over a number of different passages across your report, you have emphasised the important interaction that there should be between a fire safety strategy and a fire risk assessment. Is that right?
Yes. So when a project is handed over, the first step then is preparing the risk assessment for the building. I'll be covering that outside later on in a lot of detail, but
in module 3.
In module 3.
Yeah.
But the first step, once the project's handed over, and actually just before, is the risk assessment, which includes making sure there's an emergency plan for the building, setting up a maintenance programme. Okay,
Yeah.
so there's other activities that emanate from the risk assessment process and the record of risk assessment. So to do that well, the details in the fire safety strategy are needed for formulating that activity. So carrying out the risk assessment in the building and setting up all the other systems that will be required to manage life safety.
Yeah, I understand. Can I just take you to a couple of examples in your report where you're emphasising this connection?
Yeah.
If we look at page 15 of your report, paragraph 2.4.5.
Oh, yes.
Here you say, so this is early on in your report, you say the connection between assessing the risk of fire and the interrelationship with the package of fire protection measures in a building, and also the fire safety management provisions are explained in more detail in section 5 of, and this is British Standard quadruple 9 2008.
Yeah.
And I just perhaps wanted to read out the second paragraph of that. It says there, by carrying out a risk assessment, the consequences of fire on people, property, business and the environment can be highlighted to the owner, occupier, operator, tenant, designer and insurers. It should then be clear what fire safety systems are required, what function they have in relation to the protection of people, property, business and the environment, and what management responsibilities are required to maintain and operate these systems.
Yeah, so that's the assessment of risk, which occurs when the fire safety engineer is preparing the fire safety strategy.
Yes.
So I really, really want to keep that totally separate from the statutory risk assessment required by others.
Under the RRO.
Under the RRO.
Yes, I understand.
So you know, there, like I said, there's always multiple solutions possible.
Yeah.
But how one hones in on the solution is understanding the particular hazards to the particular occupancy or other features of the building.
Yes.
And in assessing the resulting risk,
Yes.
there will be one or more preferred solutions. So it's a fundamental part of how fire safety engineers formulate a design.
Yes.
A fire safety design.
Yes. And does it follow from what you've said that if you're doing a fire safety strategy for an existing building, any fire risk assessment that's been done previously is a very important source of information?
Yeah. It should be a very important source of information because it should tell you if there are, quite frankly, problems in the building, so that are either being repaired or will be repaired or repaired at a later date.
Yeah.
It should tell you any particular characteristics of the people, you know, people who are vulnerable in the event of a fire.
Yeah.
So there's very important information should be in a fire risk assessment about the profile of the people and the profile of the building itself.
Yes.
That you would then factor in to your professional assessment and thinking about the risk, you know, the hazards that building poses.
Yes.
I hope it's that clear.
Yes.
Was that clear?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you say, if we look at page yes, in your first report, you said that the results of investigations required for the existing building fire strategy will be significant findings for the purpose of a risk assessment.
Yes,
is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, that doesn't appear in the later versions of your report, but does that still, is that just an error?
I'd say that's a terrible error. I apologise. Yeah,
that's fine.
It's absolutely...
yeah. So that was
absolutely.
For the transcript, that was at 5.4.19 of your first report.
I'd like to put that back in.
117. And you've pointed out that past 9/11/2007 is also relevant here. If we can go to BSI 6066, page 10 again. And there at 4.1.A, this is about understanding the purpose of the fire strategy. It's saying prior to preparing the strategy, it's important to understand those involved fully appreciate and understand the purpose of the strategy. The main benefits are, and then at A, it's to prompt a full and thorough consideration of the fire safety requirements of the premises in question and of its occupants. So that's the point you were just making, I think. Yeah. So would you agree on the basis of that documents like this publicly available document, suggest that when a body becomes responsible for a building in respect of which there's no existing fire strategy, they should procure one in order to facilitate meaningful fire risk assessments?
Yes, I agree with that, because I can't see there's any other way of preparing and managing all the duties you have under the RRO, the Regulatory Reform Order.
Yeah. And I think if we look then at on page 49 of your report, paragraph 3.6.19, you say there, in section 2.5 of my report, I set out the need to have a full understanding of the existing fire safety provisions when assessing risk in an existing building. So overall, is it right that you consider that in order to assess the risks posed by fire in a building and determine how they will be minimised, it's necessary first to have a full understanding of the condition of the building, the existing fire safety provisions and its compliance with building regulations relating to fire safety?
Yes, and its condition, its ability to perform to the required standard.
Yes.
Yeah.
And likewise, but conversely, an understanding of the fire risks posed by a building, given its characteristics and occupants, is a fundamental part of developing a new fire strategy.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Now, just a few questions now on fire safety engineering and then the competence and CPD relating to fire safety engineers. Can we turn to a document INQ 3011281? This is a document entitled Fire Safety Engineering that's produced by the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers. It's called Guide E, and it's the 4th edition dated June 2019. So this is a recent document.
Okay.
And I just want to look on page 14 of this, at section 2.1.5 in the right-hand column. And this document is talking about the need for an integrated approach. And I just want to ask you briefly some questions about this. So those paragraphs, if I'm going to read them first, it says fire safety, so 2.1.5 on the right-hand side, fire safety legislation and guidance thus far has been primarily driven by disasters and architectural trends and has arguably been playing catch-up for a number of years. The growth and consolidation of fire engineering as a profession, fueled by the demand for more complex building and the use of modern construction methods and materials, has led to the need for the fire engineer to adopt a more holistic, considered approach to design, rather than simply providing specific technical solutions. Now, just pausing there, would you agree with the sentiment that's being expressed there about the fact that the growth and consolidation of fire engineering as a profession, fueled by that demand for more complex buildings, has led to the need for a fire engineer to adopt a more holistic, considered approach? Do you agree with that?
I think there's a lot of very complex points in that paragraph. And so because of that, I can't simply say yes, but I don't know that you want to hear anything more about it. You see, I don't agree that fire engineering is simply about, holistic approaches to design. I think it's any form of professional advice regarding fire safety is fire safety engineering.
Yeah.
That paragraph represents a culture that has been a concern to me and others for a while, that fire engineering is something that's done in just kind of peculiar circumstances.
Yeah.
And the rest of the time, I'm not quite clear what it is done. So probably best to leave that.
Okay.
It is true that legislation is driven by disaster and architectural trends. And it is true that there is more demand for fire safety engineering professionals when people have complexity on their projects, yes.
Yeah, okay, that's helpful. In the second paragraph there, it says it's important that in developing the fire safety design for a building, the fire engineer gives due consideration to how the building will be constructed and how it will be occupied and operated, as well as how it will be managed and maintained once completed.
Yeah.
The assumptions about all of these factors should be documented in the fire safety strategy that the fire engineer delivers.
Exactly.
And you agree with all of that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And in terms of that, does that represent what you would regard, I mean, this is a 2019 document, does that represent what you would regard as good industry practice for a fire engineer between 2012 and 2016?
It's what should have been good industry practice in that time period, yes.
Yes. Now, competence and fire engineers and CPD, just a few questions about this. Do you consider that there was, at the time of the Grenfell refurbishment, adequate definition of the minimum qualifications and competence of fire engineers?
Sorry, will you just repeat that again?
Yes.
Do
Do
I
you consider
remember?
that there was, at the time of the Grenfell refurbishment, adequate definition of the minimum qualifications and competence of fire engineers?
If you mean through the IFE, they had a definition?
Yes, so I'm going to come to that in a moment and take you through that. Maybe shall I just
Yeah,
take you
okay,
through that?
yeah.
So if we go back to that Fire Industry Association guide, the 2015 guide we looked at earlier, if we go to INQ 3011219 at page 3, this is entitled Notes on the Use of this Document. But if we look at the penultimate paragraph at the bottom of that page, we can see it says this: it's the client's responsibility to ensure that any fire engineer that they intend to use on the project is competent. And then it says this: the only industry-wide competence criteria that exists for fire engineering companies has been developed by the Fire Industry Association Fire Engineering Council. Do
Yeah.
you see that there?
I do. That's their opinion.
Yeah. And if we look at another Fire Industry Association document relevant to this, if we go to INQ 3013948, this is something entitled Guide for the Procurement of Fire Engineering Services, and it's got a section headed Competence.
Yeah.
And I just want to look about 5 paragraphs down. There's a sentence that begins, the Fire Engineering Council of the FIA. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So, and I'm just going to read it and some following paragraphs. It says, the Fire Engineering Council of the FIA have developed a competence assessment process as part of their membership criteria. That remains the only widely accepted criteria for competence of fire engineering companies in the UK. The Fire Industry Association competence criteria depends on companies employing chartered fire engineers, i.e. chartered engineers specialising in fire safety. And it says chartered fire engineers are engineers who've been through a verification process to prove that they have the adequate education, training and experience to work as fire engineers. This procedure is overseen by the Engineering Council, the same body that oversees chartered engineers within structural engineering and other well-established professions. And then it says the Fire Industry Association would therefore encourage anyone who employs fire engineering companies to use one of the companies who are members of the Fire Engineering Council. By doing that, clients will have demonstrated that they've taken reasonable measures to ensure the competence of their fire engineers. Now, I've read that out to you in full, and so was that your understanding at the time that there was this competence assessment process through the chartership scheme? Is that correct?
Yeah. So the IFE is the only body that produces chartered fire safety engineers.
Yeah.
The FIA is a trade organisation.
Yeah.
Okay, and their opinion is for companies rather than individuals to register with them. I don't want to get those two things
I see, that makes sense.
mixed up, okay?
Yeah, that's helpful.
So it's a trade organisation, and to join it, there are rules.
Yeah.
Okay? The IFE produces chartered fire safety engineers.
Yes.
It's overseen by the statutory body, I believe, the Engineering Council is.
Yes.
And that's the formal method available
Of becoming a chartered
fire engineer.
Yes.
Okay.
That's very
Is
helpful.
that okay?
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Can you just tell me this? What's the makeup of the FIA? You say it's a trade body, but it would help to know roughly what its membership encompasses.
There's a list of companies that are members of it, so I probably should say now that ARUP are not a member of it.
Right. But what sort of trades, so to speak?
Fire safety engineering companies.
And others?
Oh, I genuinely don't know. That's not something I've checked.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, you yourself talk about the merits of chartership, paragraph 2.3 of your report. Can we pull that up now? If we go at page 13 on your report. There we can see you've got a section about chartered, and you say at 2.3.1, an engineer or other building professional identified as being chartered has been registered as a professional in accordance with the requirements of the Engineering Council. Yeah. And you outline at your section 4.6 and following on page 82, you go through the ex-over staff assigned to both the existing and the refurbishment fire strategy reports. Sorry.
Yeah. I don't have 4.6 on my screen.
No.
Perhaps we can just pull up.
But you will in a minute.
Oh, okay, that's all right.
Sorry,
Yeah.
if we can just pull up 4.6
Sorry.
of your report on page 82. Actually, I think it starts from the page before.
Yeah.
You go through the key staff at Exover, and you tell us whether or not they had chartership or not. And you state in that section that the only member of staff who was a chartered engineer and therefore subject to some form of regulation as an engineer by a professional body was Dr. Claire Barker, who was the peer reviewer of Kate Cooney's existing fire strategy report. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah. Can I just see the next page again,
Yes,
please?
sorry.
Yeah.
I think that's on the next page.
I think that's later. It's okay. That's fine. It's later on, I think.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry,
It's
I may
okay.
have the wrong reference. I'll try and get that reference for you. But you can recall you
Absolutely,
said that
absolutely.
she was the only one that had
Yes.
chartered status as an engineer.
Yeah.
And therefore you conclude at paragraph 4.6.17 on page 85. We go to that.
I think it's the previous page, isn't it?
4.6.17, so it might be the next page.
No, previous page, I think.
Yeah, here we go.
Your conclusion is that no one from the Exover team working on the refurbishment project was a chartered fire engineer. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In your professional opinion, would it have been necessary for a chartered fire engineer to be involved in a project of this scale and nature?
So, I think the best way of answering that question is that since about 2015, our policy has been that all our work is reviewed and certified by a chartered fire engineer. And I made that decision in 2015 because I was sufficiently worried about variety of standards in our profession. In our organisation, we have very experienced professionals who are not chartered fire safety engineers.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important that an organisation has requirements for competency, knowledge, learning, skill to an appropriate standard, such that, you know, whether an experienced person is chartered or not, what you do as a professional is to the right standard.
Yes.
In the future, I think I would prefer if we can reach a point as a profession where being a chartered fire safety engineer becomes, there's other, say, so-called registered professions. I think in the future that's something, I'm thinking about in that context. But strictly speaking, there is no requirement for a chartered fire safety engineer to sign off on a project at this time.
Yeah.
But I think there is a duty on the company to have the persons who are employed and responsible for signing off to be at an equivalent level of competency.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think what you're saying is it would have been more important to make sure whoever was assigned to the refurbishment project was competent to carry out that work,
Yes.
whether or not they were chartered.
Yeah, I'm not just going to simply say you're not a chartered fire safety engineer and therefore you should not X or Y.
Yeah.
That could be an opinion.
Yeah.
But I think if you're very experienced and your company has very clear rules on standards of competency, standard of knowledge, standards of skill, that's very important, as opposed to getting through a chartership process.
Yeah, I understand. Now,
So should we understand then that what you say in paragraph 4617, although a statement of the evidence about the evidence that you've seen isn't to be taken as a criticism of itself of Exover?
Yeah, so in that sentence, it means nothing else.
Right.
Later on.
Well, we'll see
I'm
what
clear-
you say later
clear
on, but I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, that's just a statement of fact at that moment that X and Y are not chartered. And nothing more at that stage.
Thank you.
yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Just briefly to finish off about chartership, just so we're all clear on the consequences of if you do have chartership. Is it right that as a chartered engineer, Dr. Barker, for example, would have been subject to the Engineering Council's regulations and its UK standard for professional engineering competence? There's a UK spec from the Engineering Council that any chartered engineer, including a chartered fire engineer, would be subject to.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And if we could just bring up that Engineering Council's UK spec, this is INQ 30139550 at page. Sorry, bring that up. There we have it. This is the third edition, which was published in January 2014, of the UK Standard for Professional Engineering Competence by that Engineering Council. And I just want to just look at a couple of references in this document. On page 30 of it, it's got some minimum qualifications that are required to have chartership status. Is that correct?
Sorry, where are you?
So
Sorry.
education,
Yeah.
it basically...
Oh, sorry, yes, it does. Yeah.
Explains that knowledge and understanding are important components. Formal education is the usual, though not the only way of demonstrating the necessary knowledge and understanding.
Yes.
And the following qualifications exemplify the required knowledge and understanding for chartered engineers, and then it gives some guidance on that. And then at page 33, in the bottom half of the page, this Engineering Council document sets out certain codes of conduct which members are obliged to comply with if they have chartership status. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And we can see there are 15 broad requirements of conduct, including having a proper focus on fire safety, keeping up to date, and also I think whistleblowing is in there as well somewhere.
Number 11.
Yes. Raise a concern about a danger, risk, malpractice,
Oh,
or
yes.
wrongdoing
Yeah.
which affects others. Blow the whistle.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, then I just want to ask you about CPD. In this document, if we look at page 35 now, the Engineering Council, if we look in the third paragraph on this page, it states there, whilst most engineering professionals undertake CPD, this is often on a casual basis without any deliberate planning, recording of activities, or conscious reflection. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
So that's what the Engineering Council is saying in this 2014 spec about CPD.
Yeah.
And it doesn't require that each institution should specify a set of core criteria which must be met or studied by their members. But if we look at the Institute for Fire Engineers now, we can see if we go to INQ 30013947, this is a Institute of Fire Engineers Guide to CPD and Professional Development Portfolio. And we can see it's dated April 15 at the bottom. And if you look within this document on page, if we go to page 7, we can see it's beginning a heading, levels of activity and type of study.
Yeah.
And then if we go over to page 8, we can see that the headline message at the end of that section in the box, recommended level of CPD activity summary, is 25 hours per year of formal study time. And then informal study time equates to half of the actual time spent, and then it gives some further detail there.
Yeah.
So do you agree that at the time of the Grenfell project, there was a requirement from the Institution of Fire Engineers to be undergoing some CPD each year?
Yes, I do.
In your experience, is that CPD often provided by manufacturers?
Yeah, so my experience is there's different forms of CPD and training. So in what we do, so that's my experience, 70% of we adopt the 70-20-10 rule. If you're into learning, that's kind of a thing. So 70% is working on projects with other experienced people who supervise and teach you on the project. 20% is, probably what people would recognise as CPD, where we either invite in experts or an expert in our own team would give a very detailed training session sufficient to help you actually change what you're doing or get better. And then the other form of CPD is manufacturers or, people who sell systems or materials invited in to explain their system and how it's been made appropriate for the marketplace from a fire safety perspective.
Yeah.
So CPD is it's a bit of a generic term, but it covers very informal sessions with product people.
Yeah.
More formal sessions with other experts and on the project training. I think it's a mix of things in terms of producing competence in an organisation.
I understand.
Yeah.
But sticking with that phenomenon of manufacturers
Yes.
providing some CPD, do you agree that that's a practice which risks the communication of information in a manner that's not wholly objective?
Yeah, so I don't know if I'd call a manufacturer coming in to our company as CPD, actually.
Yeah.
So, but if one did, it is good to hear these things, but you have to apply very specific judgment and open-mindedness and challenge when you're listening. Yeah. If the only CPD occurring in an organisation is from someone selling a product, that is obviously a concern, yes. Yeah. It's not enough.
Yeah. Now, can we just look at some evidence, some oral evidence from Dr. Pearson, Dr. Tony Pearson, that he gave on the topic of CPD? If we can pull up the transcript, day 19, page 7. I want to look at lines 2 to 14. And he says this there. Actually, let's get the question before we go to the answer. So if we can go to the page before. At the bottom of that page, I ask him now, just thinking back to your time on the Grenfell project when you were at Exova, were you carrying out regular continuing professional development, CPD? Was that part of the regime within Exova? And then he said this, at the time there was very little formal CPD within Exova. They had a regime of regular training days and encouraging people to visit external seminars and whatever training appeared relevant at the time. The training budget was somewhat cut in 2008 during the recession, and the reinstatement of that budget was rather a slow process, should we say. And then I say, I see, and then I say, can you recall anything that you did specific to external fire spread, any particular courses or CPD that might have been relevant to that? And he says no. Now, just on the back of that, we just wanted to get your opinion. How much formal CPD would you expect a reasonably competent fire engineering firm to have been providing in the years, say, 2012 to 2014?
Do you mean the frequency, or do you mean like weekly, monthly? Is that what?
Frequency, yes, but also the nature of it. What type of CPD would you have been expecting to be provided by a competent fire engineering firm?
I can only tell you my own experience.
I understand,
and
yes.
What we do. So we have what I would call, well, it's not constant, but we have weekly, monthly training sessions. We have a whole programme of events planned throughout each year for all the different grades of people who work for us. So I'm aware that other fire engineering companies equally have very regular in-house or external knowledgeable persons coming in to give sessions in their organisation. I think it's a very important part of being a fire safety engineer. It's a profession where, for example, I've been working a long time relative to others in Arab Fire, and I still have to do very detailed learning and training, to keep up with, say, changing legislation, changing techniques, changing materials. It is a very constant part of making sure your knowledge and skill is to the standards required.
Yeah.
If we look back to 2012,
Yeah.
which is a few years ago now,
Yeah.
is it possible for you to give us an idea of what the minimum amount of CPD, formal CPD, would be for a reasonably well-run fire engineering group?
I don't
company?
I don't know how to answer that question in hours, because I've never added them. I've never added up what we do and thought about it that way. But in 2012, the obligations on people like me regarding keeping up our knowledge and skill are no different to the requirements of us today.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, I asked the question, but it might be said, well, Arup is going beyond what is essential. I mean, different companies no doubt have different standards or different expectations.
Yeah.
And I was trying to get a feel for whether you are, as it were, at the top of the scale rather than...
I don't really actually even want to talk about Arup as such, but, we have very healthy competitive relationships with other fire safety engineering companies. And I am very clear that they also do detailed and informal training. It's just a really important part of the profession. They would have to tell you how many hours or the frequency, but I observe what they do. You know, we're a bit of a collective in terms of sharing knowledge at times.
So would it be fair to conclude that in any well-run fire engineering concern,
Yes.
there would be regular formal CPD
Yes.
in the form of lectures and classes, if I can use that
Yes.
expression,
Yeah.
on at least a monthly basis?
On a monthly basis.
Well, give or take over the course of a year.
Yeah. I think we would do it monthly. I can imagine others might do it less frequently, maybe once a quarter.
Right.
But I kind of feel like I've just made that up in the sense I didn't ask anybody before I came.
No,
I think
it's very helpful, though, because
Yeah.
it's obviously important that we understand what is the sort of range of professional education that people might be
Yes.
expected to
Yeah.
provide, so that if any criticism is going to be made of anyone,
Yes.
we have some yardstick to go by.
Understood. I think
I think that's very helpful.
I think CPD means something. You know, it has a meaning.
Yeah.
And it can be quite informal. So
Yeah.
the cladding guy comes in and it's very interesting, okay? The most important part of training for fire safety engineers in any company is working on the projects with more experienced people.
Yeah.
No, it's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, just one question, then I think we can break.
Yes, very
on the back of that, would you have expected a reasonably competent fire engineering firm to have made available courses relevant to before an external fire spread back in 2012? Would there have been some specific CPD that would be relevant to that topic?
A course on, do you mean a course on how to read the...
Well, it could be anything to do with external fire spread or B4 more generally. But would you have expected there to have been some component of a CPD programme that would address that?
So for B4, typically calculations are carried out for the fire spread between buildings rather than up the building.
Yes, that's section 13 of
Yeah.
ADB. Yes.
And I would imagine, if you read Exova's fee proposals, they offer that numerical analysis. So I must assume that they offer training to their staff.
Yeah.
In terms of B4 and materials, at that time in 2012,
Yeah.
I think it would have been unlikely.
Yeah.
By 2013, I did go back. I dug out all my old notebooks the other day to see what I was up to. By 2013, we were sufficiently worried about materials and certificates that we started to run joint fire and facade seminars together within ARUP. Is
Yeah.
that oh yes.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, that's a good moment
Point.
for a break.
Yes.
Thank you.
Dr. Lane, we're going to have a short break now.
Okay.
We'll come back at 20 to 12, please.
Okay, thank
And
you.
as I've said to all the other witnesses, please don't talk to anyone about your
I won't.
evidence
Okay.
when you're out of the room. Thank you very much. Good. 20 to 12, please. Thank you. Would you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Dr. Lane, ready to carry on?
Yeah, I am. Thank
Good,
you.
thank you. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. So I now want to come on to the appointment of Exova by the TMO and start looking at Grenfell-specific matters.
Is it okay if I just clarify something very briefly?
Yes, of course.
I was trying to think of a better way to answer the last set of questions. And I think I want to be honest that any company that provides fire safety engineering services, I do think that it should be chartered fire engineers sign off on that work. And therefore the minimum training provision from the employer is the minimum required by the Engineering Council. That's the minimum in my mind, that staff are enabled to do that. Anything else is beyond, above and beyond.
Well, now that's obviously your view as of now. Would you have taken that view in 2012?
Yes, because the rules have not changed from Engineering Council about the minimum number of hours.
Right.
So thank you. Yeah.
No, thank you very much.
Yeah, that's helpful. Now, you note, and we don't need to turn this up, I don't think, at paragraph 4.3.12 of your report on page 53, that there was no bidding process, you call it, for the appointment of a fire engineer to the Grenfell project, and that Marcus Kiefer of Studio E contacted James Lee and Terry Ashton at Exova directly. And we know that there was an ongoing relationship with Exova and the TMO, including Exova's work on the Calc project. I just want to ask you, in your experience, would it have been normal in the construction industry at this time for fire engineers to be appointed without there having been an open tender process? What was the norm at the time?
So all different types are the norm.
Right.
So that we would have to bid on a project, against other companies. Other projects, you're asked to prepare a fee.
Yeah.
Frankly, if you're in a position where you and the client agree the scope and fee, obviously that's a nicer position to be in commercially than, competing against 20 other companies. So both types are common practice for fire safety engineering companies.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you explain in your report that Exova can be considered a, quote, top-tier fire safety engineering consultancy firm. We can see that if we go to your report, page 55, paragraph 4.3.24. At the bottom of that page, you say, worth acknowledging here, they can be considered a top-tier firm with extensive experience, and that's their industry reputation.
Yeah.
And then if we go on at page 59, paragraph 4.3.34, having noted Exova's expertise and qualifications, you say this: by appointing Exova, it would be entirely reasonable for the TMO and Artelia, indeed any party, to assume that the Grenfell Tower primary refurbishment project team had access to and could rely on highly competent experts for all aspects of fire safety design and compliance. And then in the next paragraph, you say this: because this is not necessarily the case for all projects that are undertaken in the UK, I think this is a most important point when considering how the events of the Grenfell Tower fire came to be. Now, I just want to ask you about that.
Yeah.
What do you mean when you say because this is not necessarily the case for all projects that are undertaken in the UK?
Not all project teams, not all clients even appoint a fire safety engineer on a project.
Yeah.
Okay. So this project had the benefit of the appointment of a professional fire safety engineering company.
Yeah. And when you say, I think this is a most important point when considering how the events of Grenfell Tower came to be, again, what do you mean by that?
I mean that the team and the client had access to relevant fire safety, should have had relevant access, to competent advice.
Yeah, okay. Now, if we look at the existing fee proposal and scope of work. So if we pull that up, this is at EXO 401382. This is dated the 11th of June 2012. So what I want to do is I'm going to look at the existing fire strategy work first, and then we're going to come on and look at the refurbishment work. So this letter is dated the 11th of June 2012, and if we can go to page 2 of this report, we can see that the proposed scope of works is a retrospective fire safety strategy report for the existing building. And we can see there that it says in that end of that first paragraph, the design of the building will be assessed against relevant design codes relating to the statutory requirements, including the RRO 2005 and also under the London Section 20 of the London Building Acts at that time as well. We see that there. And then we can see the fee proposal at the bottom of that page is quoting a sum of, right at the bottom there, under fee proposal, is quoting a sum of £2,865 plus VAT for that work on the existing fire strategy. And we can see that this proposal on page 3 was written by James Lee, a consultant at Exova, and reviewed by Terry Ashton there. We can see that there. And we know that TMO accepted the fee on the 27th of July 2012 in an email from Appleyards. For the transcript, that's EXO 50122. Now, and you've also noted in your report that there's no evidence that anybody queried the fee or kind of had any difficulties with that fee at the time.
Yeah.
You note that, I think, at paragraph 4.3.50 of your report on page 62. Now, turning to the adequacy of that fee proposal, can we pull up page 60 of your report, paragraph 4.3.45? What you've done here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is set out all the tasks which you think would have needed to have been undertaken in order to provide a fire strategy for the existing building. Is that correct?
Yes.
So you've listed out here, starting with attending site, understanding the building, then you've gone through, I'm not going to read them all out, all of the different stages of analysis, information gathering, and then if we go over the page, we can look that it goes down to J. We could just pull, that's great.
Yeah.
Look at the top of that page. So we can see understand the existing fire safety risk at G, fully document their investigation at H, set out clear gaps in compliance, I, and therefore establish the need for any mitigation measures, which, again, you discussed that earlier about that's part and parcel of the fire strategy work. And then you say, at paragraph 4.3.46, you say, it is my opinion that it is impossible to do all this in 3.5 days. Now, just to be clear, you've got the 3.5 days by applying Exova's hourly rates to that fee proposal of £2,865. Is that correct?
Yeah, approximately.
So you've calculated that they seem to be, give or take, it might not be
about
precisely.
that time. So less than a week.
Yeah, saying that they will spend that amount of time. And it's your opinion, is it, that that was an inadequate period of time to spend on an existing fire safety strategy?
Yes, it is.
Now, I just want to look at the oral evidence of Miss Cooney on this point, because in her evidence, Miss Cooney was asked about this. If we go to the transcript, day 14, page 193, lines 5 to 17, so if we pick it up here on page 12, this is Mr. Millett asking her questions, and he says at 12 on that page, how long will it normally have taken you to prepare a final draft, client ready, for a fire strategy for an existing building such as Grenfell Tower? And she says, a number of weeks, solidly for a good number of weeks, I would have thought, if it was to meet all the requirements. And then he says, right, just to be clear, how long would you take normally to prepare a first draft? And then she says, again, 2 to 3 weeks, 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 2 it's dependent on the amount of information we have, right? Okay, can I ask you? And then she says, up to a week, I suppose. And then he says, I'm sorry, I cut across your answer. And then if we go on to the top of the next page, she says, anything up to a week, a few days to a week, depending on the information we have. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
So her evidence was that preparing a final draft, client-ready, of an existing fire safety strategy would be a work covering a number of weeks, solidly for a number of weeks.
Yes.
But perhaps preparing a first draft would be, she says, up to a week, a few days to a week.
Yeah.
Do you agree with her estimates, first of all, of how long a client-ready final strategy would take, and then a draft?
Yeah, so I think it's about a week, she said, for the first draft. And was it 3 weeks or a few?
She just says solidly for a good number of weeks, a number of weeks. She doesn't give
A number of weeks. Yes, so I agree that the first draft, you know, you would do well to get it ready in a week, but it's absolutely possible.
Yeah.
And then several weeks of toing and froing, getting all the information, doing all the discussions. If you think back to that list of things to do in the past, absolutely I can imagine taking several weeks to produce the detailed existing fire strategy.
Yeah. And in your opinion, what would a reasonable fee estimate have been? Remember, this was back in 2012 for that work. Now, I'm not looking at a precise figure, just approximately. We know they were quoting 2,865 plus VAT.
So that was for, honestly, if we multiplied their weekly fee by 4 or 6, I just haven't done analysis like that, I'm afraid, about what Exova should have charged.
I see. So we could take their hourly rates across a week.
Yeah,
and
so
you'd
well, that's
say
what that's
between
what
4 or 6 weeks of work.
yeah, that's what they seem to do. So.
Yeah. And in your experience, did you ever experience at the time people querying fees? Would it be normal for clients to come back and say, well, that's too low, that's too high? Would you expected clients in this case to have queried the fees that were proposed?
So clients do query fees normally, particularly in that first half, 2000 to about 2015. It would be, why can your fee be lower? I think what was it, £2,500? It's about £2,500.
It's 2,865.
£2,800 to produce an existing fire strategy. I suppose you need to understand the scale of what's involved, but the fee proposal was actually quite detailed.
Yeah.
So I would expect an experienced client or experienced architect to maybe ask a question, can you get this quantity of work done in that period of time?
Yeah.
But obviously, human nature is, if you're offered a low fee, you're going to take it. I mean, that's not an expert opinion. That's just the way things are.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I want to come on now to discuss the site visit before we look at the existing fire strategy itself. And I want to ask you about the visit that was undertaken. Now, in general terms, where you have an existing building, which is the subject of a fire strategy, or you have a building that's to be refurbished, how important is it, in your opinion, for a fire engineer to visit the building on which they're writing a report?
So, as I said earlier, the big issue about an existing building is all the unknowns.
Yeah.
So it is very difficult to complete your work or offer robust advice without doing your own inspections. Now, it's absolutely the case sometimes, and it's happened to me, where you may simply not get paid or allowed to, go to site and go to the level of detail that you might like. That does happen. But then you have to qualify your advice and explain exactly the limits of your work.
Yeah.
So my preference would be a site visit to really deal with all these unknowns. Where that's not possible for whatever reason, you must now set out exactly what it is you need from others.
Yeah. So we know in this case that a site visit was possible.
Yes.
In your opinion, would any reasonably competent fire engineer have visited the building if they were preparing an existing fire safety strategy?
I would very much, if you're lucky enough to get paid and given access to the building, it's the optimum set of circumstances. So yes, I would expect that as a minimum from a fire safety engineer to then go.
Yeah. Now we know that Mr. James Lee states at paragraph 3.6 of his witness statement, for the transcript, the reference is EXO 401740, page 3, that he did conduct a site visit on the 29th of May 2012 in order to review the existing condition of the tower. And he says such a visit would ordinarily involve spending no longer than 2 hours walking around the site. Now, in your report, if we look at paragraph on page 88 of your report, paragraph 4.7.14,
I think it's the previous page.
sorry, let's go, yeah. Yes, sorry, that's the wrong reference. So there you say, it's my opinion that 2 hours is wholly insufficient to make a meaningful appraisal of the fire safety features of a building of the scale and condition at the time as Grenfell Tower. Now, can you just explain to us exactly why you say that? Why would you need more than 2 hours to do what needed to be done?
You know, you have to have your safety briefing, you need to do a walk around to familiarise yourself, you need to try and find where the fire safety measures are. I would expect people to take measurements, take photos of the smoke control system, the doors, the conditions of the lobbies. I just really don't understand. I couldn't get that done in 2 hours, and I just can't imagine how anyone could get that done in 2 hours. In 2 hours, I would do what I would call a cursory walk through the building, and I don't consider that to be a site inspection.
Yeah. Approximately how long, in your opinion, do you think would have been sufficient if you were preparing the existing fire safety strategy?
If I was sending fire engineers to a high-rise residential building of that scale, I would expect 2 people to go and to spend at least a day.
Yeah.
2 together. 1 person to take notes and photos and to cross-check each other's observations.
Yeah.
On the site.
And in your opinion, would it be appropriate for, say, Ms. Cooney to rely upon a site visit conducted by Mr. Lee? So in your opinion, would it be reasonable at the time for a fire engineer to rely on a site visit that another colleague did?
If the site visit is well documented with notes and photographs, yes, it is reasonable to rely on, you know, an accurate record.
Yeah.
And to talk to that person about what they've seen.
Yeah.
And we would do that a lot.
And now, just for a moment, I'll come back to James Lee's site visit in just a moment, but just thinking about Mr. Ashton for the moment, he's, we know, responsible for carrying out the refurbishment fire safety strategy reports.
Yeah.
In your opinion, should he have carried out his own site visit with respect to fire safety as it affected the refurbishment works?
Do you mean after he reviewed what James Lee produced?
So
or
at any stage, do you think he ought to have visited the site?
before he did his work? Or ever?
Yeah, or ever.
Okay, so I think that it would be reasonable for him to rely on his, let's call it the site team who went.
Yeah.
And if they gave a very accurate record, which they didn't, okay? So then he's in a position where, you know, if he hasn't got good records available, it would have been better, wouldn't it, for Exova to send another team to do a site inspection? I mean, I just...
Okay.
I think that for any engineer to write the refurbishment report, they needed to rely on the existing fire strategy, which should have been based on a detailed set of site inspection notes.
Yeah.
None of those things actually happened at Grenfell Tower.
Yeah. Now, can we look at this point at paragraph, page 255 of your report? No, actually, I'm not, sorry, we're not in the right report, I've just realised. We need to be in BLARP 2, 5017 at page 255. Yeah, so if we can keep bringing up that 17 version of the report, that would be great. So if we go there, paragraph 8.3.1, you say this, you say, I've seen no evidence in the documentation provided to me that James Lee recorded any information relating to his site visit of the 29th of May 2012, either in the form of handwritten site notes, photographs or marked up drawings. Now, in fact, it does appear that James Lee did take a series of photographs.
Yeah, that's correct.
During his site visits, and these are exhibited to his witness statement.
Yeah, and that is referred to in my report.
Can we just look at those photographs just for a moment? This is EXO 401749. So we see a series of photographs. I think it's across 24 pages, so we can't show them all. But perhaps if we could just scroll down a few pages just to get a sense of the photographs. Yeah. And if we could keep going. Now, I just want to check, first thing, have you seen these photographs before?
Yes, I have.
So when you've given your opinion about the site visit, you have taken these into account?
Yes, I have.
And do you consider that any helpful information would be provided by these photographs?
I can't orientate myself looking at these photos, and I struggle to see what they're for. So I would, if I had been given these photos, I would need to have a written description beside it or it pasted onto a drawing saying I took the photo here, and if you refer to this drawing, this is what we observed in this location.
Yeah.
And other information.
Yeah.
I cannot interpret those photos myself.
Yeah.
Maybe others could.
So I think you're saying you would need other information sitting side by side with these photographs to be able to make any sensible use of them.
Yeah, you have to understand their location and even a short written explanation as to what it is being observed and why.
Yeah.
And typically people paste them onto a drawing with some arrows, and you have another little text box with some notes. So then other people in the future can refer back, orientate themselves, which is absolutely critical, and work out the location of the photo and consider the building in that location.
Yeah. And would you have regarded that as a minimum standard of competence back in 2012 to produce that from a site visit?
Yes.
Now, I just want to just take stock of what Ms. Cooney had available to her when she drafted the existing fire strategy report, which she produced.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to list out what we had. We know that she had the original plans of Grenfell Tower on microfiche.
Yes.
She'd had a discussion on the telephone, she said, about the layout with James Lee, who did the site visit. She had these photographs, which we've just covered. She reviewed the then current fire risk assessment. That's Mr. Stokes's fire risk assessment dated December 2010, which she'd been sent. We know she had an email exchange on the 10th of August 2012 with Mr. Soons about issues such as the dry riser and the lift.
Yeah.
Yeah. She had some more information about the existing smoke lobby system, but we know she hadn't visited site herself. Now, given what we know about that and the information she had, do you consider, in your opinion, that was adequate information on which to draft an existing fire safety strategy?
I think that it's very limited information to attempt to draft an existing fire safety strategy.
Yeah.
And professionally, I would be uneasy.
Right.
One could still write a draft.
Yeah.
Okay. But there are, I would want to see quite a long list of all the information not available, all the things I couldn't work out. And sometimes that's all you can do, is write a strategy that literally says,
I just need all this information. Write a report and set out all the information you need and why, even under each part of the building regulations.
Yeah. Now, in her oral evidence, she was asked about what information she had. She was asked about whether there were she had any access to any fire safety policies. She said no, she didn't think so. She was asked whether she had access to any fire safety management policies or procedures, and she said no. And she was asked whether she'd requested any maintenance records. And she said, no, but I wouldn't normally ask for maintenance records for a fire safety strategy. Now, in your view, would all of those things be matters that you would be asking for? Fire safety policies, fire safety management policies, and maintenance records?
Yeah. So one needs that information, because when a fire safety engineer writes an existing strategy, one of the critical points is explaining what's performing or not in that existing building. You have to know if the fire safety systems are performing to any standard.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think something that really strikes me from that time is that Bruce Soons told Kate Cooney the lifts were not firefighting lifts in an email.
Yeah.
Whereas the risk assessment says the lifts are firefighting / evacuation lifts.
Yeah.
And that's a really good illustration about that next step of checking or investigation the fire safety engineer needs to do. You now have two conflicting pieces of information. It's quite common.
Yeah.
So now I need those records to establish for myself independently, is Bruce Soons correct, or is Carl Stokes and his risk assessment correct, or is it something else entirely?
Yeah.
That's what makes existing fire strategies so complicated.
Yeah. And just to be clear for the transcript, I think the exchange you're referring to there is an email from Mr. Soons dated the 10th of August 2012. That's at EXO 401592 at page 2, where he says it's not a firefighting lift.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, if we can now turn up on page 298 of your report and look at in section 10, I want to look at 10.1.3. So you say here in this paragraph, Exova had a contract to ascertain the existing building condition and set out its fire safety condition at that time. By means of this work, as I have explained earlier, they had a duty and the opportunity to understand the condition of the active and passive fire protection measures in Grenfell Tower, both with regard to the original regulations and the current regulations as they saw fit at the time.
Yeah.
So you're describing it there as a duty and an opportunity. Can you just help us as to why this was an opportunity to understand those measures, and how important was that opportunity?
Yeah. Well, it was an opportunity because the professional team realised very early in their deliberations during Stage C that they were making changes to the building, and that they correctly understood that those changes could impact fire safety standards. Okay. So the existing fire strategy was commissioned, and so this was a moment in time where a competent person could understand exactly what condition Grenfell Tower was in with respect to its active and passive measures, and also how the people were being protected in the event of a fire. And I particularly mean, say, people who may have needed assistance and arrangements being made for them. So there was an opportunity to be very open and honest with the client and the design team. X and Y systems are a concern. Let's get back to the lifts again. The risk assessment says they're there to enable evacuation in the event of a fire. Is this actually correct? So there was an opportunity to properly define the baseline safety condition of Grenfell Tower.
Yeah.
Is that, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
And just to be clear, I think you say in your report that that work on the existing fire safety strategy should have fed directly into the refurbishment fire strategy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the refurbishment brief could then say, we're going to fix X and Y, you know, we're leaving A and B, for example,
Yeah.
and we're going to mitigate it a different way.
Yeah.
So you take that baseline safety condition and you're absolutely explicit about what the primary refurbishment is going to deliver in terms of a fire safety objective.
Yeah. Now, at paragraph 5.7.1 of your report, if we go to page 157, here is the section where you're setting out your conclusion about the adequacy of the existing building report. And you've identified a number of inadequacies. You've listed them all out very clearly here in your conclusions section. Now, we're going to discuss some of those in more detail shortly, but before we do that, I just want to ask you some more general questions. If we then go over the page, at page 158, we see the rest of the list. And then we can see at the bottom of that page, you say, in summary, I find the existing fire safety strategy report for Grenfell Tower to be wholly inadequate for any relevant purpose to which it was supposed to be put. We see that there.
Yeah.
And if we look over the page at the next two paragraphs, top of that next page, you say it could not therefore be relied upon as an up-to-date explanation and record of the existing building condition, and it could not therefore be relied upon to carry out the statutory fire risk assessment as the TMO had a separate duty to do. Now, did you have experience of seeing existing fire safety strategy reports produced by other professionals at around this time? Because what I want to ask you is, was that report surprisingly inadequate, or do you consider that that reflected shortcomings across the industry at the time?
I've really focused on Grenfell Tower and all the work I've done for the inquiry
Yes.
so far.
I understand.
I suppose the best way of putting it is that, as I said right at the start, by 2015, I was sufficiently concerned about varying standards that we made our decision about signing off our own work by chartered fire engineers.
Yeah.
Yes, I have seen good existing fire strategies, and I have seen bad ones.
Yeah.
I can't really help you any
No.
further than that, other than go off and find other strategies and come back here and tell you what I found.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
Now, unknowns and assumptions, one of the inadequacies which you have referred to at paragraph 5.7.1F on page 157, if we just go back to that, is that you say at the bottom, Exova's report does not adequately identify future investigation actions for Exova or others for all aspects of the building where they define information as not known, nor provided any explanation as to how that missing information had been factored into their assessment of the risk at the time. Yes?
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Millett explored some of this when Ms. Cooney gave oral evidence, and he put to her that there were a large number of assumptions made in the report or unknowns listed within it.
Yeah.
Is it normal, in your experience, to make some assumptions when carrying out a fire safety strategy on an existing building? And I think we should take into account that Ms. Cooney said this was a draft strategy she'd provided. Her work was a draft.
Why do we need to take that into account? Sorry, what do you mean by, it sounds like a qualifying remark.
I see. So what I would ask you is, at that first draft stage
Okay, sorry.
of a fire strategy,
Yeah.
would it be normal to make some assumptions when writing that first draft?
So the purpose of a draft is to get more information.
Yeah. But is it right that, in your opinion, although it identified assumptions, it wasn't clear about future investigation actions?
No. So I would expect to see the information that was required and why it was required and by when, and even assigned to particular individuals if needs be.
Yeah.
and a clear statement that until that information is available, the report cannot be relied upon.
Right. Yeah. Now, can we just take some examples and look at some examples? So at pages 121 to 142 of your report, what you've done is you've reproduced a section of Miss Cooney's report on the left, and then your comments on the right. Is that right?
Yeah.
So we see that, and this is in, I think, A3 in the original version. So we can see that there. And if we can go first to page 124 of your report. And if we could blow up the top of that page. So what you've done is you've helpfully segmented the sections of their report into little boxes. And we can see that looking at that introduction box on the left, I'm sorry this is so small.
Yeah.
In the third paragraph, Ms Cooney's written, this existing fire safety strategy covers the fire precautions in place in the existing building as built in the 1970s, drawn up from information gathered through non-invasive site survey, a desktop study of the original plans from the microfiche archive and the current risk assessment. And then she says in the next paragraph, she says, it is expected and therefore assumed that the existing building has been built to the prevailing standards of the day, thought originally to be the building regulations 19, I can't quite read that, 65 possibly, which did little more than require the structure of the building to have fire resistance. So there she's saying it's assumed that the building has been built to the prevailing standards of the day. And then in the next paragraph, she said it's assumed that the various provisions required by the above legislation have been maintained since the building was constructed and subsequent amendments have been carried out with the approval of the regulating authority of the day. So she's making assumptions about the existing building being built to the prevailing standards of the 70s, and then she's saying it's assumed that various any amendments subsequently have been carried out with the approval of the regulating authority of the day. Yes?
Yeah.
And then we can see on the right-hand side of that page, sorry, it's hard to refer to these, but
would it be worth expanding half the page?
yes, if we now expand the lower half of that right-hand side of the page, if we could do that. And there you can see where you've set out in the fourth paragraph, ex over state, and there's a quote. Do you see that there? It is expected, therefore, assume that the existing building has been built to the prevailing standards of the day. And you say this, ex over do not identify the specific documents that represent the prevailing standards of the day for Grenfell Tower, neither do they provide any information on steps that they took to verify that it was compliant with the standards that would have been current at the time of the design and construction of the building. And then you note in the next paragraph, they've assumed it's been maintained since construction and any amendments have been carried out with the approval of the regulating authority. And you say in that paragraph, ex over do not identify what, if any, steps they have taken to verify that the building has been maintained and that any amendments satisfy the relevant legislation and guidance. I consider it wholly inappropriate for an existing building fire safety strategy to make such an assumption.
Yeah.
Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Now, just to be clear on your evidence, is it your evidence that both of those assumptions, both the assumption about being built to the prevailing standards of the day and your assumption about how the building's maintained, is it your evidence that both of those are inappropriate?
The whole point of an existing fire safety strategy is to be clear on what is there.
So you don't think it's acceptable to assume that it must have been built to the prevailing standards and it must have been maintained and had the approval of the regulating authority since?
If I was given that report, I would ask, what does that mean to me now in terms of the fire safety, how I can protect life in that building? What does that actually mean?
And is that because in your experience it can sometimes be a false assumption to assume that building works have been carried out to the appropriate standards?
Yes.
Now, I just want to look at what Ms Cooney said in her evidence about this when giving evidence to the inquiry. If we can pull up the transcript day 14, page 121, lines 9 to 17. And she was asked about this assumption at line 7 by Mr. Millett. Now, on what basis did you form that expectation or assumption? And her answer is this. She says, on the basis that the building, having been long-standing in the same use as it was constructed to be used for, and the very stringent adherence to acts such as the London Act, Section 20, etc., and the requirement for a fire risk assessment being in place for several years prior to, I think it was a reasonable assumption to assume that any works that had been carried out had been done in a workmanlike manner, and that there was no significant deviations from the guidance. Do you see that there?
Yep.
And she also explains later in her evidence that she thought there was nothing unusual about its layout at the time. Now, the points I want to put to you are, this was on her evidence, a first draft of a report, and it was requested within a short time frame. How much work would have been involved if Ms. Cooney had checked those assumptions?
How do you mean it was, sorry, what do you mean it was requested in a short time frame? Sorry, I'm afraid to answer
Well, I
the question.
I think we probably have to read that as requested from her within a short time frame. I
Oh,
think
sorry.
you're right.
Okay, I understand.
Within
because
Exover's
in terms of-
instruction, it's
there was-
not a short time frame.
Exactly. So if we can
Yeah, I
park that
understand.
remark, I've now actually forgotten what you asked me. I'm really sorry.
No, that's all right. So I'm asking you, the points I want to put to you are, it's a first draft of a report. How much work would have been involved if she'd had to check those assumptions, and was that reasonable to carry out?
If I understand you correctly, so they had been to the site, they had some drawings, they had access to staff at the TMO who had knowledge of the building. Even an email or a request for a meeting, there's very simple ways to get another layer of information, so your assumptions are reasonable.
Sorry, which assumptions are reasonable? Was it,
That
I think you're critical of her for assuming that it was built to the prevailing standards and assuming that it was, any subsequent works had been approved by the relevant authorities. I think what you're saying, is it right, is that those things should have been checked. Is that right?
Absolutely, because
Right.
if that's not true, it has some very significant actions arising.
Yeah.
And I think I'm trying to say that there's simple ways to explore those 2 points more,
Yeah.
so you're not making such a sweeping assumption.
I see. Yeah. And if you were sending a fire engineer off to do this report, you would expect them to have carried out those checks, would you?
Yeah, so yes, I would. So when they come back from site with their measurements and photographs, which, you know, one would then compare with the prevailing standards of the day. Remember, there were active systems in that building with well-documented problems at the time. That needed to be looked into too. Those systems did not no significant deviations from the guidance, and there's another thing about maintenance, that it wasn't applicable to everything in the building.
I see. Would it be relevant that there was nothing in the material that Exover had which would suggest that there'd been unapproved works carried out from a planning or building control perspective?
Do you mean with the drawings they had?
Yeah, would it be relevant that in none of the information they had there was anything to suggest unapproved works had been carried
Okay.
out? Would that be relevant?
So that's a piece of information, but that's why your own independent inspection of the building to make sure that's a valid piece of data still is so important for when you're formulating an existing fire safety strategy.
Yeah. Now, Ms Cooney acknowledged that at the time her draft report was prepared, she did not have all the information required, including in part because certain aspects of the building had not been addressed in the fire risk assessments provided to Exova, and she expected that Exova would receive some feedback in relation to the areas in which assumptions had been made. Mm-hmm. Now, do you consider that was reasonable on her part to put these assumptions in and assume that if anyone's got any evidence to contradict that, someone will come back to her and say, well, actually, you've made that assumption, it's not correct?
No, I don't think it's acceptable to issue a report and then wait for other people to notice what the problems are.
Why not?
Because I think that they need assistance from the competent person in understanding what the issues are and why, and what the next steps are.
Yeah, okay.
That kind of passive, the report's gone out, we're done. I don't agree that allows the report to end up being more than a draft. And any report a fire safety engineer issues, the whole idea is it doesn't stay draft for very long. It's to become an issue version because that last bit of work is done or the information is received from others.
Yeah.
You need to take the next step.
Yeah. Now, can we take another example? Can we go now to page 131 of your report? And I want to focus at the top of that page, first of all, on the left-hand side where we see the extract from Ms Cooney's report. At 3.3.4 in the there, she's dealt with evacuation principles in the residential areas. And she's said there, the recommendations in the current guidance of approved document B support an evacuation strategy which is based on the following assumptions. And then in the third bullet there, she said, due to an assumed high degree of compartmentation and therefore a low probability of fire spread beyond the dwelling of fire origin, simultaneous evacuation of the building is unlikely to be considered necessary. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And then if we look on the right-hand side, you have, in that box, first of all, set out an extract of what she says there from that third bullet point. That's the third line down. And then you say this, however, Exova do not identify what information they have relied upon to make such an assumption or what performance criteria are required for the fire compartmentation. And then you say Exova go on to state in their third bullet, simultaneous evacuation is unlikely to be considered necessary. And then you say that follows the form of guidance in, and then you give a reference in ADB. I know Exova provide no direction to the responsible person as to whether any preparation might be required to enable simultaneous evacuation.
Yeah.
So you're making 2 points there, and I want to focus on the first point.
Yeah.
So you're saying she doesn't identify what information she'd relied upon to make an assumption about the high degree of compartmentation. Can you explain why that was so important that she did that?
So let's take fire doors. Okay, a very important part of the compartmentation between the flats and the lobby. What did Exova do to establish their performance in Grenfell Tower?
So you would have expected them to have taken some steps to identify what the fire performance was of, say, the flat doors at levels 4 to 23?
Yes, because on the site inspection they will have had opportunity to observe them and ask questions about when they were installed or not, relevant to the drawings Miss Cooney had.
Yeah. And can you help us, in fact, was the assumption of a high degree of compartmentation, remember this is for the existing building, was that incorrect to make that assumption that there was a high degree of compartmentation?
Well, I can say that now, yes. So the fire doors were installed in Grenfell Tower in some part by then.
Yes, that had been in 2011, yes.
And the smoke control system was not operating as it was required to do. And that's also part of protecting the firefighting shaft and escape compartment.
Yeah. I see. Yeah, that's helpful. Now, Sorry.
Had you finished?
Yeah, it's just in a building with the stay put strategy and in an existing building with that strategy. That's why the site visit is so important, because you're so reliant on those features.
Yeah.
That it's, yeah, anyway, I
Yeah.
made the point, yeah.
Now, just going back to something you say in your report on page 147, paragraph 5.4.31, you say in this section, if there were aspects of the building condition that were not known by the appointed competent person, ex-over, as they stated at the time, then presumably the responsible person, KCTMO, did not have access to that information either. Now, on what basis have you presumed there that the responsible person wouldn't have access to that information either?
I think what I was trying to say there is, if the TMO were relying on ex-over to produce an existing building strategy, it's reasonable to expect that the condition of the, let's say the basic active and passive fire protection features would have been considered by them. So if they don't communicate that in that report, it means the TMO or the responsible person, won't have the benefit of that information.
Yeah. Now, turning to a different subtopic, another inadequacy that you've set out, this time at paragraph 5.7.1e on page 157, if we could pull that up.
Actually, I think I better just say another thing there, just moving quite quickly.
Sorry.
I was also trying to make the point that I would expect the TMO to also give any other information they had to the fire engineer appointed by them to do the existing building condition.
Yeah.
Okay, so they have an important role in being open and honest with the fire safety engineer who's going to carry out that work for them.
Yeah.
So it's two specific things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at 5.7.1e on page 157, you've said that ex-over's report doesn't identify the relevant guidance used as a benchmark for ex-over's assessment. And I just want to look at a couple of examples where you've highlighted that. Now, if we go look at page 127, again into your table. And when you're dealing with section 3.2.1, so on the left-hand side, sorry, we could start on the left-hand side. We can see Ms Cooney's draft report, and it's got at 3.2.1 levels 1 and 2. And she says it's unknown whether the community areas and nursery are supported by or something
Are covered by
an automatic fire detection system or a manual system. This provision of AFD would not necessarily have been required at the time of construction. And then it says, indeed, today, it then says a manual system may be the minimum level required by the regulatory guidance. Do you see that there? As the travel distances to the closest story final exit from the building would comply with current permitted travel distances. So she's made an assertion about compliance there.
Yeah.
And then if we go to the right-hand side of your table, I think 5 paragraphs down. So it's just below the middle of that page. There's a paragraph beginning, the ex-over fire strategy does not. And it says, does not identify which regulatory guidance is being referred in this section.
Yeah.
Further, the language used in the statement, indeed, today a manual system may be the minimum level required, does not give a clear direction to the TMO as to the requirements for detection and alarm. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Now, this is just an example, and there are other examples you've given in this long table of where you would expect to see it actually stated what the regulatory guidance is that they're drawing from. Now, can you help us as to why you think it was important that that regulatory guidance was highlighted by ex-over in their report?
So I would expect them to explain what they had seen installed or not in those rooms, any requirements from from the time the building was constructed, and if they thought what was installed in the building at that time remained appropriate.
Yeah.
Because those rooms before the refurbishment were part of a single stair building in a residential building, and typically you don't share stairs, for example.
Yeah, we're going to come on
Okay.
to that point.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But going back to the point about it's not identifying which regulatory guidance is used, and the point I want to put to you is, we know that these reports are going to be used principally by the architect to help its design guidance. Would you expect architects to be able to read and understand ADB for themselves, or something like ADB for themselves? Why do you need to spell out, if you're ex-over, what the regulatory guidance is?
How do you know she's referring to the ADB there? That's my problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know. I can speculate. I don't know. Should an architect be able to interpret that English precisely? I don't know that any person can interpret that without considerable personal inference, and I just don't agree that that's an appropriate way to communicate. I genuinely don't know what document she's referring to, what it says in there, and what I need to now do. Architect or not, I should be able to understand that from a report.
I see. So what you're saying is it should be crystal clear on the face of the report exactly what guidance she's referring to in each part of the report.
I think so. And then even if one doesn't list out everything, the reader can go to the original source and even read it for themselves then.
Yeah.
Okay, so, yeah.
So you don't think it's reasonable to say, well, we know that architects are going to be one of the end users of this report. We can rely on architects to know what the regulatory regime is and to know for themselves which bits I'm referring to.
Absolutely not.
Now, just a small point then on this part. We can see there that you're critical in the next part. So in that same paragraph, you've made the point about not identifying regulatory guidance in the first sentence. And then you say further, the language used in the statement, indeed, today, a manual system may be the minimum level required. Yeah. You say it doesn't give a clear direction to the TMO as to the requirements for detection and alarm on levels 1 to 2. It's unclear if a manual alarm system is the minimum permitted version. Now, the point I'm asked to put to you is, was a manual alarm system, in fact, the minimum permitted level of alarm and detection at the time?
At this time?
Yes.
I think I wrote that it was, yes.
Yeah.
It's in strictly speaking. But if I was giving advice back then, I now have to contemplate the fact that this is a high-rise residential building with other uses sharing a stair, and I would feel obliged to risk assess that and maybe give other guidance.
Yeah, I see. Why do you say it was important that she gave clear direction about that rather than using the word may?
Because honestly, reading it here and now with you, I don't actually know what she means.
Right. Okay. Now, omissions. I want to deal with that topic now. You've highlighted a number of omissions in the existing fire safety strategy, and I want to take you to some examples of points where you say that items were missing. If we can start at page 124 of your report. Actually, no, I think that's actually try 129. Yes, and I want to look this time at the box at 3.3.2 on the left-hand side. Ms. Cooney has described existing arrangements for means of escape from levels 1 to 2. So I'm not going to read it all out. That's what she's done in those paragraphs. And at section 10 of your table on the right-hand side, if we now skip to the right, in the final paragraph of that box, you've said, of box 10, you've said the existing fire safety strategy does not identify if the means of escape provisions are suitable to satisfy the requirement of Article 14 of the 2005 order. Therefore, this section does not assist the responsible person insofar as no practical guidance is provided. Now, can you just help us as to what more you think Ms Cooney should have done and said about the RRO specifically in that instance?
Well, it's more that I would like to have read her professional opinion that it was sufficient or not for means of escape from the existing building, and then relate that on. So I don't mean listing out, text from the RRO. It's more, are her observations or is her text, it's gone again.
Let's go back to her text,
yeah.
put it on the left-hand side, 3.3.2 in box 10.
Yeah.
She's describing the escape in the first paragraph. Then she's talking about the boxing club's capacity.
So
and then she's saying there's an open void, and then at the end of that, escape can be made away from the void without having to pass within 4.5 metres of the opening. So
I mean, I think I would expect then some professional statement saying, and this is sufficient because, or it's acceptable to leave it this way, or just some concluding remark. So it's clear there isn't any other action or any other fire safety measure required.
Do you think there might have been reason to believe that the existing arrangements weren't satisfactory for the purpose of the RRO?
At the boxing club, in the boxing club, that's not something I've looked
at that level. Okay.
Yeah, no, I haven't thought about it that
I understand
deeply.
Then if we look at paragraph 3...
Sorry, I probably should say.
Yeah.
So I think, so you can't look at just one particular thing and make a big conclusion about the RRO.
Yeah.
Okay. In Grenfell Tower, at that time, the smoke control system was not operating as it should. It was a high-rise residential building with a mixed use. The fire doors we've talked about a lot in phase 1. There was all sorts of complexity that needed to be considered when producing the existing fire strategy.
Yeah.
It's not fair for me here to just point at this one particular sentence.
No, I understand. If we look below this at paragraph, on that same page right there, we can see, but box 11 below is internal layouts level 4. And she deals with that issue in the paragraphs there. If we could go down the page so we can see the whole of that box. Yes. So she's talking about level 4 contains the office accommodation, no access to the stair or lift in the central core, assumed that AFD is present in the entrance lobby. And then in the second paragraph, if the accommodation communicates with the firefighting shaft lifts, then the core in this area should be protected to 2 hours and 1 hour fire doors. Single escape route from the building. The exit should be lobbied to provide a minimum of 30 minutes fire-resisting construction and no combustible materials. So she's discussing level 4 and the requirements there. And then she says in relation to travel distances, in the last paragraph, she says travel distances as the layout offers escape in more than one direction back to the entrance lobby, provided the lobby is adequately protected, this would be satisfactory. And then if we go across the page to look in section 11 of your table where you're addressing this, in the third paragraph down within that box, you say Exova do not identify if the escape arrangements comply with ADB 2010. They simply describe the arrangement without providing specifics such as existing travel distances. Do you see that there?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, the point I'm asked to put to you is, would the travel distances have been apparent from the drawings? So would someone have been able to work out, based on the drawings, what the travel distances were?
Do you mean that Kay Cooney could work it out, or the reader of the report?
I think the reader of the report
would now take out drawings and a ruler and mark it for themselves.
Yeah.
I think I would expect the drawings to have been marked up to support the point being made, which is kind of some kind of narrative, I think, around the approved document B, rather than an explanation of her views on the existing building.
I see.
So personally, I think that it should not be down to the reader of the report, because that could be all different types of people with different types of competency, that they would now need to take out drawings and do the work themselves again. No, I don't think that's reasonable.
Okay. Is her conclusion, though, she says it's subject to adequate lobby ventilation with the ability to escape in multiple directions, the travel distance are acceptable. Were those conclusions a legitimate one for her to have reached?
In the context of that one paragraph of the report, I have to keep saying what I'm saying all along is I can't say that one particular sentence is adequate when I've explained what the conditions of Grenfell Tower were at that time.
Right, okay. And if we can just go over the page to see what else you say over the page at page 130. You say at the end of that box, you say to summarise, section 3.3.3 of that existing strategy does not confirm the existing fire safety provisions or what additional measures should be provided to allow the responsible person to fulfil their duties under the RRO. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Can you just help us, why was that information for the responsible person under the RRO, why was that so important to be recorded in the existing strategy?
Because they said in their scope of work that's what they were going to do.
Right. I see. Yeah. Now, if we can now look at page 336 of your report and look at paragraphs 14, 1, 22 to 24. So right at the bottom of that page, you say here, the second major failing with the existing building fire strategy was that it failed to communicate to the TMO what actions they were required to take as a result of the existing building condition at that time, as they were required to under the RRO 2005. Existing conditions such as the status of the lifts in event of fire, the condition of the flat entrance and stair fire doors, and the absence of an active lobby smoke control system particularly required TMO's attention and even required mitigation measures from them at that time.
Yeah.
These matters were not dealt with in the existing fire strategy works.
Yeah.
Now, I think you've actually addressed in your evidence running up to this point all of those matters. You've talked about the lift, the flat entrance doors and the smoke control system.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, those are all matters that one should have been flagged, you say, in the report.
Yes.
And then do you actually think it would have been necessary for the TMO to take action on the basis of that if that had been flagged?
Yeah. So now we go into the statutory duty to carry out a risk assessment. And if you have a high-rise residential building with a stay-put strategy, and let's even just say as a minimum, fire doors to the lobby unknown, lift to the lobby unknown, smoke control system not working, okay? When you're assessing those hazards to the people living in the building, they require a careful assessment and a decision on is it appropriate to stick with the stay-put strategy? Is there something else could be done day to day to mitigate the risk those lack of performances are causing?
Yeah.
That's the whole purpose of the statutory fire risk assessment process.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, if we can now look at page 147 of your report, paragraph 5.4.34. And this, I now want to turn to a different subtopic, which is the fire risk assessment. I know we've touched on this already in general terms, but you say in 5.3.34, the fire risk assessment provided to Exova from the TMO dated December 2010 did not include the following areas, and you've listed out a number of areas that it didn't include. And then you say, I've seen no evidence of Exova requesting the fire risk assessments for non-residential areas which were excluded from the risk assessment.
Yeah.
And then in the next paragraph, as Grenfell Tower was a single staircase development with that stairs shared by all uses, this was a piece of significant information they required before forming a final opinion.
Yeah.
And then on paragraph 5437, you say further, the statutory risk assessment document provided to Exova by TMO didn't include the significant findings and action plan, an important outcome of that risk assessment process. Now, just pausing there on that, can you just help us as to precisely why the significant findings and action plan from a fire risk assessment would be so important for the drafter of the existing fire strategy to be aware of?
Because that's where you should get to read, you know, if there's a problem, it will be fixed in 3 months, 3 years. We can't fix it, so instead we're going to do the following 24 hours a day, something like that. And that impacts your assessment of risk when concluding on the overall condition of the existing building. I don't know why that really important piece of information was not sent to Exova, because it should have been.
Right, yeah. And then if we can look at paragraph 5.4.39 on page 147. You say Exova do not identify within their existing building strategy any of the shortcomings or assumptions made within the 2010 fire risk assessment. I've found no evidence of Exova receiving the significant findings associated with it, nor asking for them.
Yeah.
And then in the next paragraph, Exova do not outline the steps they've taken to independently satisfy themselves that the content of the risk assessment was based on an accurate assessment of the condition of Grenfell Tower.
Yeah.
I would expect this activity from a competent fire safety engineer.
Yeah.
Now, pausing there, can you just help us, exactly why do you think Exova shouldn't have simply taken at face value the fire risk assessment? Why do you think it was reasonable to go further and obtain the missing information or do the independent verification themselves?
Okay, so there's lots of questions in that one question.
Sorry. And
actually, I have my notebook, but I was
so
not
let's
allowed
break
to
it
write
down. Why do you think they shouldn't have simply
Okay.
taken the fire risk assessment at face value?
Yeah, so the whole point, so just kind of repeating what I've said a few times already. So when you do the site survey, when you review the plans, when you've reviewed records of how things are being maintained, you may realise something that the responsible person is either not aware of or does not think is important. So the existing fire strategy, I see it as a very important, it's almost like an independent audit at the time of the existing building. And so if you compare your work with the work of the fire risk assessor and you observed any differences in opinion or approach on what's in the building, again, it would be very important that you would raise that.
Yeah.
What was the other two parts?
So do you think it was reasonable to go further and obtain any missing information themselves?
On the significant action?
Yes, or indeed if the fire risk assessment on its face has missing information, like you said you hadn't got a fire risk assessment for the boxing club
Yes,
or other
Yes.
parts of the tower, would you have thought it was reasonable for Exova to ask for that further information?
Yes, I would, because you can't give a robust professional opinion until you have that information. And if you never get it, you have to qualify your professional opinion.
Yeah.
It's quite frankly, the scary aspect of being a fire safety engineer.
In your experience, would it ever be reasonable to assume that a fire risk assessment had been carried out properly previously?
Is it reasonable? Sorry, I actually don't
In your
understand.
experience, would it ever be reasonable to simply assume that you've got a proper fire risk assessment that's been carried out properly?
One is hopeful when one gets any document, but when you've done your own work, if you observe differences or discrepancies, you have to raise them.
Yeah. And in your experience, have you come across that situation where you've been presented with a fire risk assessment and you've found that when you've done the analysis, there's things in it that you have
Yes,
you have to raise?
Yes, I have, and we have, yes. And vice versa. A fire risk assessor may review an existing fire strategy and say, actually, I have also observed something that you have missed. I see it as, I don't want to sound as if it's only Exova. It's on both sides.
Yeah. Now, if we go to page 149 of your report now, at table 5.15, here what you've done is you've, in a table, you've listed line by line each provision of approved document B that was applicable to the tower, and then you've highlighted in reds the ones you say weren't addressed in the existing building fire safety strategy. And we can see you've done that same exercise in relation to a number of the other pieces of work that Exova produced, including the refurbishment fire strategies.
Yeah.
That's right, isn't it? Can I just ask you about your methodology here? Can you just explain why you thought this exercise would be helpful to do it this way?
I'm just conscious that, I suppose I feel very self-conscious that I'm very familiar with all of these things. And I thought that if we try to compare the work back to the standard number of headings to try and give some kind of quantum to support some of the concerns I've raised, I think I was trying to be transparent and just be a little bit clearer, instead of just giving lots of opinions.
Yeah, I understand.
It's got no further significance.
Can I just be clear, though? Is it your view that all of those points ought to have been addressed? Or are you using it as a simple tool to show how much was missing?
I'm using it as a simple tool to show what's missing. And when one isn't going to incorporate a recommendation, or one doesn't think a recommendation is relevant, sometimes it can also be very important to make clear why.
Yeah. And we can see that you have excluded some sections. You've got not applicable, like B3 section 11.
Yeah.
But are you saying that all of the others would be relevant in principle?
In principle, they should be considered.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, the next topic that I want to deal with is not that long, but it's going to be more than just 3 minutes. So
more sensible to stop at this point.
Good break at this point. Yes, please.
Yes, all right. Well, we're going to have a break now so we can all get some lunch, Dr. Lane. We'll come back at 2 o'clock, please.
Okay.
And once again, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone
Okay.
outside.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good, 2 o'clock, please. Thank you.